Austin, welcome onto the Searching for Mana show.
Thanks, Lloyd. It's great to be here.
Pleasure to have you on the show. Slightly fuller introduction. We have Austin Allison of Pacaso, the founder and CEO at Pacaso. Really excited to go into what you guys are up to right now. It's been a relatively short journey with Pacaso where you've already achieved so many things that look exciting. So keen to cut into that, but also an incredible entrepreneurial journey for Austin. So we'll have a really fun Mana round in the middle, and then at the end of the show, we'll do some future projections. And we'll also talk about the markets. The business, I'll leave you, Austin, to explain to the audience, what the user case is and why you're so passionate and excited about it. But broadly speaking, we will talk about property, and we are in September coming into October of 2022, so albeit Searching for Mana is a evergreen content show, it'd be remiss of us not to take some of Austin's macro critique on the property market right now. So we'll cover some of that, so it should be very valuable for the audience too. Austin, if you could be so kind to let the audience know who Pacaso are and what you guys are up to right now, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pacaso, spelled Pacaso, is a service that empowers people to co-own second homes together. So the easiest way to think about it, Lloyd, is imagine if you and 4 or 5 of your closest friends or family members wanted to buy a holiday home somewhere, pick your dream destination. You could self-organize and co-own a home on your own. I mean, it is possible, and people have been doing that for a long time, but it tends to be very difficult to do on your own because there's a lot of details that need to be managed and schedules that need to be coordinated. So Pacaso has created a service that makes it easy for people to co-own, and you don't have to know the other individuals. You can literally just go to our website, pacaso.com, search for a bunch of beautiful listings, and we're now in about 40 destinations around the world, with London being one of them. And you could find a beautiful property and buy as little as 1/8 of the home or as much as 1/2 of the home, depending on how often you plan to use it. So it really enables people to right size their ownership, as opposed to buying a whole home that would sit vacant, 10 or 11 months a year on average. So that's what we do at a very high level.
Thank you. So just to cut into that a little bit, why would somebody choose to take a 1/8 as an example in a second home, where if we work that out, broadly speaking, let's say it's just over a month, you could go and take a holiday home, you could get it on an Airbnb, which is the other way to look at it. What's the investment benefit, but also what's the feel-good factor about doing that through Pacaso, as you say?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So the way that I like to answer this question is by thinking about the menu of housing options on a spectrum of usage. Like, imagine if we were sitting in front of a whiteboard right now, Lloyd, and I drew a line across the whiteboard, and on one end of the whiteboard you have infrequent usage or transient usage. On the other end of the whiteboard, you have frequent usage, which would be like 6 months per year or more. On the infrequent usage side of the whiteboard, let's call it, 1 time a year or less. For that use case, there's a lot of great options in the travel and hospitality industry, from hotels to short-term rentals. It just really doesn't make sense to buy a home if you're only going to use it once a year or less. For the other end of the spectrum, if you're going to use a home 6 months per year or more, we recommend that you buy the whole thing, because at that point in time, owning the whole thing has certain advantages that outweigh the advantages of co-ownership. Where co-ownership comes into play is everything in between. If you're going to use a home more than once a year, but less than 6 months a year, that's the use case where you would want to co-own a home. And the reason why is because, if you're not using the home more than 6 months a year, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to own 100% of it, because the home's just going to be sitting vacant, costing you money and creating a lot of waste that just isn't sustainable. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're going to be using a home kind of more than a week a year, there's a lot of advantages of owning. that you really want to consider when compared to renting. One advantage of owning is you actually own the real estate, and Pacaso tends to operate in really great real estate markets that have limited supply and lots of demand. And if you look at the performance of those real estate markets over a longer period of time, what you'll find is that they tend to be really smart places to park money. Had you bought real estate in London or Malibu or almost any other location on our website 10 years ago, you'd be pretty happy right now, right, with the value of your investment, because these are good real estate markets that have very limited supply. But there's also a lot of other kind of practical and emotional benefits of owning that you don't get when you're renting somebody else's home or staying at a hotel. One practical benefit is, an owner, you get to keep your stuff at the property. So if you're going to visit, like if I live in California and I'm going to visit London 4 or 5 times a year, it'd be pretty nice if I could keep my stuff there, right? And with Pacaso, you can do that. Every owner has their own owner's closet, so you don't have to, lug your clothes back and forth every time you show up. But the other big piece is there's a lot of real emotional, benefit and value from owning. When you own a property, you develop a connection with that property and with that neighborhood and with the people of that neighborhood that is long term. You end up developing these rituals around, restaurants that you frequent or things that you do that really enrich your life and the lives of your family. So one of the things that we tend to see in many of our destinations is a lot of families with kids will actually buy these second homes, because the second home provides a really meaningful place for the families to build memories with their children and to put smiles on their children's faces. And it's really hard to put a dollar value on that benefit.
Yes, that really resonates with me. I have a nearly 4-year-old daughter, and we go to don't know if you know Cornwall in the UK.
Yeah.
So live in London and go to Cornwall every 6 months with our extended family. And so Lily's an only child at the moment, but that extended family brings some cousins for her. And, she knows the name St. Ives. And, literally for the whole 6 months building up to it, so excited to go back to St. Ives so that we can spend time with the family and, get the kind of meals that she looks forward to. And, she's slightly scared of the crazy aggressive seagulls that you get in Cornwall. And so there's this kind of, there's this habit that you tend to find with children that they enjoy. Actually, they like to know where they might be going back to. And I love that. It's so nice. So we won't want to change that. So at the moment, we don't own a property there. We found a particularly nice accommodation that feels like it's good vibes for a family, but we're just renting that every time we go. So we're kind of probably just on the cusp of that middle of not once a year and certainly not 6 months plus, where it'd be interesting to figure out if a Pacaso is a good situation for us, because the accommodation we're going to, it has other people staying there every other week of the year, right? Whereas if we could have it shared with 4 families, several families, and we had that, like you say, you could leave some bucket and spades there, some of the obvious seaside holiday clothes. I can really see the advantage. So you've got me on this one. Get your get your properties in Cornwall, and I'd love it. What is then the experience of how I would acquire to be suitable to move into that model of yours?
Well, basically, it's kind of a function of how much you use it and sort of where your budget is, right? Like if you're planning, again, if you're planning to use a home more than a week a year, and you have the money to put down as a deposit on the property, because we do offer financing up to 70% loan to value, so it requires a 30% down payment. But if you have those two things going for you, the money to put down and the usage, this model is going to make sense, because it tends to be like when you're renting a home on the short-term rental market or a hotel, again, can be a really great solution for that kind of once a year kind of a use case, but you're going to pay a lot more, on a nightly basis than when you own. I mean, as a frame of reference, like I own personally, I own a couple of Picassos, and I've analyzed, my annual operating expenses relative to the cost to own, or sorry, to rent a comparable home in the market. And what I've found is that, my annual operating cost to own is about equal to what it would cost me to rent 2 or 3 weeks
Yeah.
in a comparable home, at any given point in time, without all the ownership benefits, right? So as long as you're going to use the home, a few weeks a year or more, you're going to end up saving a lot of money by owning a Pacaso when compared to renting, and deriving all the ownership benefits that we discussed before. So
Okay.
those are the things that I'd be thinking about as a customer.
Love it. And then Austin, I'm thinking about it from an investor's perspective, not from a venture capital perspective, we get to that, but
Yep.
from, I want to get one of these, I want to get a Pacaso, as you put it. I like that. I'd like a Pacaso. And we'll ask why that's the name of the business in a bit. But how do I look at an event? So, I get my 1/6 of this Cornwall property, and for whatever reason, in 2 or 3 or however many years it is, I decide that doesn't work for me anymore. Perhaps we've moved to America. One example. So I want to exit. Example 2 is I think I've made a good return on my investment. Could you explain those 2 scenarios for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you buy a Pacaso, you're buying real estate. So the way to think about it is pretty consistent with how you think about buying a whole home, with one difference. The difference is, with Pacaso, we make it much easier. I mean, when you buy a Pacaso, you can literally find a home on our website and be an owner of that home in the next day.
Amazing.
For the traditional real estate process, that could take, months. In some markets, particularly some markets throughout Europe, I mean, it could take 6 months or 9 months to close on a property from the time you start searching. So with Pacaso, it takes 1 day. We've made it really easy to buy and really easy to sell. So when you buy a Pacaso at any given point in time, if you wish to sell or transfer to another Pacaso at another location, we make it really easy. And so far, what we've experienced is that the resale transactions have moved very quickly. On average, in about 10 to 12 days is what it takes on average to resell a Pacaso. And they've traded up about 15% annually compared to what the owners paid previously. So we've actually seen them, trade in some markets, actually grow in value a little bit faster than what the underlying real estate grew in value, because it's so, easy to transact. So that's what you should know about the transaction process. But in terms of how to think about investing in real estate, we don't recommend Pacaso as an investment. You should be buying a Pacaso if you wish to use it for your own personal use and enjoyment. It's not something that I'd recommend as like a pure investment. But what I will say is that real estate has historically proven to be a pretty smart place to park money, particularly during recessionary and challenging times. I mean, if you look back at almost all the prior recessions over the course of the last few decades, with the exception of what happened in 2008 here in the US, which was really a real estate centric recession, but all the other ones, real estate proved to be one of the most stable and safest places to park money. So I think we are seeing a lot of people really look at Pacaso as a smart way to own real estate, and also an accessible way to gain access to markets that previously were pretty out of reach. Like, not just anyone can afford a $8 or $10 million penthouse in Mayfair. That's very expensive and iconic real estate that's out of reach for most. But with Pacaso, there's a lot more people who can afford a $800,000 share or $1 million share, right? Because that requires $300,000 down. Still a ton of money, but a lot more people can afford $300,000 down than $3 million down. And Pacaso really opens up that door for a lot of families.
Yeah, I just trying to get to the moment where I really get it. You've explained that amazingly, but I just want to push back on that one more time. If I'm cranking at the top end, so I'm more looking at the 4, 5, 6 months, because I'm sold on I'm going to go to Cornwall for 2 times in the year, like I do. And actually, with Pacaso, what I try and do is I immediately try and find, well, maybe actually then I'll go 3 or 4 times a year, which I'd like to. Just as you say, it's like an incredibly expensive thing, and it's it's a bit of a pain because it's not set up as it would be if you had your kind of things left there. Brilliant. If I'm more 4 to 6 months, and actually particularly if this is at the top end, then I'm looking at, I've got to put quite a substantial amount of money down into this. And the minute you get into that arena, you're starting to think, well, what if that amount went into traditional real estate where I owned it? And, as we know, somewhere like a London, whether it will be for the next 2 years, but has gone up a lot. I'd make a lot of money from that. Have you found that a struggle to get that end of the person who's consuming into a Pacaso?
Well, first, I would say that this is traditional real estate. I mean, when you own a Pacaso, you own the real estate. You just own the real estate with a group of other people. So I'll give you an example. My wife and I, own our home together, and our home is owned in an LLC, and we are both members of the LLC. So just because my wife and I own the home through an LLC doesn't change what we own. We still own the home. So when we go to sell that home, we're going to benefit from all the appreciation that accrued in that home. The same exact thing is true of Pacaso. The only difference is you generally have more than 2 owners. You'll have up to 8 owners. On average, I would say we'll see about 6 owners, because usually 2 people will buy a quarter, and then the rest of the group will buy an 1/8. So it is traditional real estate in that sense, and that's kind of how I would think about it. But in terms of the 50% question, it comes down to 2 things: cost and hassle. Like, just to use some simple numbers, let's say that it's a $1 million property. If you were to buy a $1 million property, you would have to put 20 to 30% down, so $200,000 to $300,000 down, and you would have to pay the full operating cost of that home, which is probably $5,000 per month, roughly, or pounds per month, roughly. If you were to buy, and you would have to deal with all of the hassle, by the way, you'd have to pay all the bills, you'd have to do all the repairs and maintenance, you'd have to coordinate, cleaning and services, etc. With Pacaso, if you buy half of the home, you only have to put $30,000 down on the $500,000. So it's roughly $150,000 down instead of $200,000 to $300,000 down. And you're only going to have to pay half of the operating expenses. So instead of $5,000 a month, you're going to pay roughly $2,500 a month. Now, there are some, management fees that Pacaso includes in there, but they're marginal in the scheme of the savings that you're generating from co-ownership. So that's the big reason why. The second big reason why is the hassle. I mean, even for people who can afford a whole second home and justify the waste, it's a lot of work to own a second home. I mean, it's a lot of work to own a primary home, but a secondary home is particularly difficult because you don't live in the area, right? It's you're trying to manage this home from afar, and oftentimes these second homes are in challenging, places that have, a labor shortage. It's hard to get supplies and materials there. Oftentimes you have extreme weather. Mountain towns, for example, have heavy snow, which is really hard to deal with. Desert or beach towns have salt and heat to deal with. So we eliminate all the hassle so that you can just enjoy the home with none of the headaches. And we make it a lot more affordable for you to do that by sharing the cost across more people. And that's true whether you buy an 1/8 or a half. There's just more savings if you buy an 1/8.
Austin, thank you so much. I absolutely love it. What could you tell us to give us some type of context and scale about, since you've founded the business, you've raised a lot of money, if you could talk about that, please. But also so the audience can understand, how many people are in this business now. You mentioned you're in multiple different geographical territories. So just a little bit around, some of the kind of venture capital questioning of scale and size and growth of this business to date, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded the company in 2020, but we didn't officially launch until October of 2020. So we actually just celebrated our 2-year anniversary following the launch of the company. So we're relatively new. That being said, it's grown incredibly fast, much faster than we could have ever imagined. And I think that was largely a function of the right idea at the right time with an incredible team of people who executed well. So now, to speak to the scale, we're in about 40 destinations across 4 countries, those countries being the UK, Spain, the US, and Mexico. We're about 275 people on our team, and we're fully distributed. So we have no office, and we designed the company that way from the start. So our team is spread across 35 plus states and 7 countries. We've done about $1 billion in cumulative revenue since over the course of the last 2 years since the company's inception, and growing quite quickly. In the first half of 2022, we grew by about 300% year over year. We've raised about 230 million of capital, equity capital, across 3 rounds of financing: our Series A, our Series B, and our Series C. And we have a number of really great investors that are part of that mix, such as like Mavron, Greycroft, Crosscut, and then also some investors with more of a European presence, such as Global Founders Capital, that's based in Germany. That's the Samwer brothers.
Yeah.
The SoftBank is a big investor in our company. Fifth Wall is a really incredible, real estate centric fund that has offices also in London. So we've got a really great group of people, and that's just our equity investor base. We also have a bunch of debt partners. So we've secured, a lot of debt that gives us the ability to bring these properties into our marketplace and provide great financing to our customers. So it's really been a great ride, kind of a rocket ship, as the saying goes.
Wow, that is unbelievable. Some of the firms you're mentioning, I've read and listened to and spoke to all the people I possibly can. When we get to your background, very interesting. I think, in brief, what I know from it, and that the Samwer brothers have invested in you, because it certainly fits their profile of what they look for. Amazing. So look, I'm just going to ask this contrarian question. I don't want to be a killjoy, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The last couple of years, up until 2022 was a good time to raise. Valuations were huge. There's still a lot of dry powder out there, as you know. But the conditions in the macro economy are just on its head. And so we've seen some of the quickest, most rapidly growing tech stocks have their valuations change, struggle to hire people, so on and so forth. Have you been concerned? Have you seen anything change? Or actually, has that become an opportunity for Pacaso and you?
All of the above. There was a lot of good questions baked into that one question, so I'll try to touch on them. So absolutely, a lot has changed in the macro environment, and every business that I've spoken with, every founder and company I know, every investor I know, is feeling the impact of the macro environment. I mean, you've got interest rates climbing aggressively. There's inflation. There's the war. There's all sorts of things going on, and also issues that are specific to certain regions as well. I mean, there's just kind of a perfect storm of a lot of things happening right now in the macro environment that has created a lot of turbulence and a fair amount of uncertainty. And anytime you have that dynamic at play, it's of course going to impact the way that you think about and operate a business. The way that we've been thinking about it is really just to position the company to be in a place of kind of strength, to be able to weather the storm, whatever the storm may bring. Now, there will be headwinds. I mean, we've already experienced some headwinds, and I think the biggest headwind that I think impacts a lot of businesses is that during turbulent times, when consumers feel less, wealthy and less confident, they tend to spend less, particularly on discretionary things. Like, we're selling something that for most people is discretionary. So, you think twice in an environment like this before you liquidate stocks to free up money to buy a second home. So we're definitely feeling some of that. But I would say we're also seeing some like early signs of tailwinds that I think at scale will become pretty interesting for us. One tailwind, as an example, is interest rates rising. While interest rates rising can be a challenging thing on the front end, the reason why that it looks like it might be a tailwind for Pacaso is because the alternative to buying a Pacaso is buying a whole home. And when interest rates go up, whole homes become a lot less affordable than they were before. So we're seeing more people gravitate from whole homes to Pacasos because it's a more responsible and accessible way to own real estate. I don't know if we talked about it yet, but like the pound, the difference in the dollar and the pound as an example. Obviously, Brits aren't thrilled, I'm sure, with the strength of the pound right now, but there is opportunity in there for someone, like American buyers, for example. We're seeing a lot of American buyers look at real estate in London and thinking, wow, like London's kind of 30% on sale right now. This is like one of the most iconic, and desirable cities in the world. And now, as a result of the currency changes over the course of the last year, I could kind of buy into London at 30% off. So what I've found, having lived through, a couple of these downturns now, with 2008 being the biggest one that I've lived through, what I've found is that if you're agile enough, if you're innovative enough, and if the company is sort of positioned with the cash to weather the storm, you can find a lot of opportunity in moments like this. And a lot of tailwinds will emerge on the other side of headwinds. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it and what we're experiencing. I guess the final part of your question that I haven't answered yet is around valuations. I mean, there's no question that valuations have been, corrected. And the reason, I think one of the biggest drivers of that is what's happened in the public markets, the public markets, and as it relates to private companies, because the private valuations are ultimately sort of a precursor to what investors think the company can be worth at a future date in the public market. So when multiples go from 30, 40, 50x on gross profit to 10x, it has an impact on how people think about, and 10x is even generous. There are not a lot of companies in our category are even trading at that. But I would say where we're at right now is actually kind of, it certainly has corrected quite a bit and maybe overcorrected on some level. But the multiples that we're seeing today are a lot more normal and consistent with what we've seen in the past. What we experienced over the course of the last couple of years was not normal. I mean, it was a bit of an outlier. Like, we had the perfect storm of like growth oriented activities happening. And for our business, like interest rates were low. With COVID, a lot of people were now rethinking how and where they live and work because more people had flexibility to work remote. So that created some really interesting dynamics in some of these second home markets because there was just a lot more demand than supply. So I don't think the last 2 years was normal. I think the period that we're going to enter, on the other side of this recession or turbulent time, I think will be more normal and more consistent with what we've seen over the course of the last decade.
Well, I'm impressed that you managed to remember all of the questions in my one question and get through them so eloquently. Thanks, Austin. Makes a lot of sense. Look, we'd have to do a 5-hour podcast for us to talk about property and macro markets and all the things that would be fascinating. So perhaps we can do that another time. But let's move through now to the round where we're going to find out about your origin story. So if you could really, now to change gears, go back and set the scene for the audience, as far back as you'd be kind to go, so that we got an understanding of, some of the influences you've had and who you were at a really formative age, please.
So I think the best place to start is really just kind of by talking about my upbringing. I grew up in a very modest household. My dad was a carpenter, so we lived paycheck to paycheck. There was no discretionary income. And I kind of grew up around real estate from the very beginning through my dad's carpentry. Like, I was on the job with him at age 4 or 5 with a hammer in my hand. And I think that's where the love for real estate was originally ignited. And then by the time I was maybe 8 or 10 years old, I started my first company. I mean, maybe to call it a company is a bit of a stretch, but I started my first kind of project that looked like a company, which was a birdhouse business. And where that idea came about is my dad built a birdhouse for my mother, and it really brought her a lot of joy. And he had a lot of scrap wood as a carpenter. So I asked him if he could teach me how to build a birdhouse and give me his scrap wood. And he did. So I kind of started building birdhouses, and I recruited some of the neighborhood kids and built a little wooden wagon for the back of my bicycle. And we rode up and down the street and knocked on doors and sold these birdhouses. And that was really the kind of the first moment in time that I recognized that, if you could solve problems and deliver value for people, that they would be willing to pay for, and also kind of recruit and empower other people to help you in that mission, you could accomplish a lot more than anyone could on their own. Like I couldn't have sold all those birdhouses by myself. It took my dad teaching me how to make them, and my dad giving me the scrap wood, and my little brother and my friends helping to build the bicycle and knock on doors. So it was a team effort, and we ultimately were delivering value to people who were buying these birdhouses. So that then led to, real estate for real. When I was 18 years old, I got my real estate license, and I got my license mainly because I needed to find a way to pay my way through college. So I started selling real estate, sold all through college, and kind of went on to law school actually after undergrad. And that whole journey led to my first real estate tech company, because as I was selling real estate, driving all over town, chasing buyers and sellers to get documents signed on the hood of my car, I discovered another problem, which was inefficiency. I mean, I was literally wasting hours and hours of my time and other people's time getting documents signed. And I thought to myself, kind of like that birdhouse moment, like where I was like, maybe I could build a birdhouse and deliver value for other people. So I thought to myself, maybe I could, build a software company and make real estate transactions more efficient. So that's what we did. I recruited a co-founder, and we built a team, and we ended up building this business that became one of the leading software companies, in the US, where we had about 1 million real estate agents using our software. About half of all real estate transactions in the US flowed through it. And then, we sold for 9 figures in 2015 to one of the largest real estate portals in the US called Zillow. So that's a bit about the entrepreneurial journey. It really kind of started with, following my passions and just trying to solve problems that I was experiencing firsthand. And then along the way, surrounding myself with great people who ultimately, helped me to fulfill on a lot of these visions.
Unbelievable. Well, congratulations. A really amazing entrepreneurial journey. Just a couple of questions. So if we go back to you've understood the benefit of all the things you mentioned with building the birdhouses, and then the next part in the story, you jump to being 18. So like in that part from, I think it's somewhere around 7 to 18, like who are you in education at this point? So you have a father who is a craftsman, a carpenter, and he's exposed you to to that world, and through that to property. And then in education and in school, who are you in that journey? Who are you with your peer group? What are you getting energy from? What are you maybe perhaps not enjoying? Talk us about that little phase as well, please.
Yeah, it's interesting you should ask that, because this was actually probably the most formative period of my life that I just sort of brushed over, because oftentimes I forget just how important it was. But when I was 16 or 17 years old, I was like kind of a troubled, struggling teenager. Like I was on the verge of failing out of high school. Just wasn't a productive member of society. I was kind of hanging out with the wrong people, doing a lot of the wrong things. And I just sort of had this moment in my later teenage years where I had an epiphany that if I wanted to be someone and have a positive impact on society and the people around me, I needed to change my ways. And I sort of committed in that moment when I was around 17 years old to just change everything about my approach to life. Instead of sort of slacking off in school and not taking it seriously, I would go into school early, do my homework on time, every time. Instead of kind of hanging around with the wrong people, I started trying to surround myself with people who I admired, as individuals and also professionally. And I
Austin,
kind of went.
those are really quite aware, wise decisions after this epiphany. Just again, because I want to keep
Yep.
you on this point, because otherwise, like you
Yep.
say, people can quite easily kind of skip through the narrative, which I
Yep.
think this is very valuable to anybody who might be at that particular point, and that can come at many different stages. What caused that epiphany?
I think it was just a combination of like having a negative impact on other people's life. I was just like, I was not a productive kind of member of society. You know what I mean? Like when you're just sort of wasting space and not paying attention in school and flunking out. I wasn't making my parents proud. I mean, to use a benchmark, I wanted to be someone that people looked up to, that had a positive impact in people's lives. And I think I always wanted that. I mean, maybe this is the thing that enabled me to connect the dots. I always wanted that, dating back to like my early childhood, like that birdhouse story that I told you. Like I started making birdhouses because I saw how much joy that birdhouse my dad made for my mother brought to her. And I thought to myself, whoa, if I could like do the same thing and bring joy to other people and get paid for it, that would enable me to just like deliver more value, to the people around me. And that felt good.
Yeah,
When you're delivering value for people, it really feels good. Like my first company, as an example, it we basically got to a point where 4 or 5 years in, we had so many customers and so many real estate transactions happening on our software that I would be traveling, for a real estate conference, or I would even just be traveling for personal reasons. And I would run into real estate agents or people who had bought homes previously, and they would tell me all these stories about how the company really changed their lives. I was like crazy stories. Like, my mother was ill and we were in the hospital trying to sell our home. And your software enabled me to sign the documents while sitting bedside to my mother, as opposed to the old way I would have had to drive into the real estate office to get this deal done. And you start to hear those types of stories, and it's like, wow, that feels pretty good. Like
yeah,
me and my team had that impact. So I guess I was having, the opposite impact on people in my teenage years, basically
yeah.
from age like 12 to 17. And by the time you get to the end of high school, you're sort of forced to think a little more seriously about what you're going to do with your life. Like, am I going to get into college? Like, if
Yep.
I was going to get into college, I had to change something about my patterns in order to get my grades up enough to graduate from high school,
Yeah.
because I was on the verge of failing out, most of my classes. So I just changed everything. And I mean, literally when I started in college, I basically wore a suit and tie every day. I did a dual degree program. So I went to school for 2 years or 5 years for both degrees. And I showed up at 7 a.m., 7 to 7:30 a.m. every morning. So I was the first student there. I was the last student to leave. And I basically just paid attention. I respected the professors. I did my homework. I studied. And, in college, a lot of people, don't take it so seriously. They're there to party or hang out and have fun. And I was the guy sitting at the front of the room, taking it seriously, selling real estate on the side. And I went from being like basically on the verge of a high school dropout to being the number one, graduate in my college. And I became the student marshal and got an academic scholarship to law school. And, that just opened up all these other doors, which obviously led to my first company, which led to my second company, etc. But it all started just by like changing my perspective and my outlook on life. And I decided I wanted to be a person that would have a positive impact and leave the world a little bit, better off than how I found it.
Well, congratulations. We have, as part of the Mana Group, Mana Search, which is a search business. So we have to, we've got the responsibility of looking at a bunch of individuals who, mostly are keen for a particularly great opportunity that we might have, and then trying to critique who we think, shortlist is, and who we ultimately think, there's a connection with the mana and the vision and the purpose of the business. And, you have to look at just so many different things. But let's say there's one thing that I believe some people in the industry do, which is they'll kind of see a cross on the CV or in the experience, and then that's it, discard that individual. So what we believe is, from this relatively interesting psychology determination, which is, if you can make a bad impression with somebody psychologically, and then you can turn them around, they will like you more than if they just liked you to start with. It's really interesting human psychology. And I think that that's no truer than actually internalizing with yourself. So if you can find somebody, wherever it is, where there's a moment where they've been down in the dumps, things aren't going how perhaps they aspired for them to, but they can have the realization that they want to be better, then the discipline, the affirmation from that moment, and then the trajectory of that individual is actually something that we look for, because we think that type of contrarian who's had that epiphany moment disciplines and aspires in the most optimum way. And again, you've been a classic example of where, I don't even need to cut into too much that very successful software business that you created at such an early stage. It probably is that same discipline that you had suddenly in education, where you made sure you're first in, last out, applying yourself. You're even hustling on the side to pay the bills to get through it. You've taken things to a level of like, I expect these huge things of myself, because the outcome is, I can provide wonderful value from being the best I can be. And so, Austin, like, congratulations for you. It's a really inspiring story. I absolutely love it. Let's jump to the mana round. So to set the scene, you're on Searching for Mana, and mana is in gaming magic. So you have power, which is your life. Think of that as the CV. And then you have your magic. This could be, you can run really quickly, jump really high. You've got great sword skills, whatever it might be. So we're going to ask a few questions, and we're going to try and find out what your mana is, what your magic is, what your superpower is. If you could have the front cover of Forbes, or whatever your most dear, precious publication might be, what would you put on the front cover?
I would say the message of the cover would be like, he earned it. Like everything that, like, I don't believe that there's an overnight success. I don't believe that anyone succeeds alone. I think that most of the people who have made a kind of a big impact on the world, like, they earned it. They worked their tails off. They sacrificed a lot. They surrounded themselves with a great team. Like, as an example, for me, the only reason I went to law school was to basically become a better version of myself. I had no intention of practicing law. I went to law school as academic boot camp. And law school, by the way, is like not an easy thing. It's very, particularly the first year, is very, very difficult, especially when you're like working and selling real estate on top of it. So I kind of put myself through that just as a tactic to make myself better and position myself to overcome more challenge and hardship in the future. So I would say that would be the main thing, is like just doing whatever is necessary to like get the job done. That's probably the main. Yeah, I think that would be the cover that I'd prefer.
Love it. Do you have any particular ritual to set you up for the day?
Yeah, I have several of them, but just to highlight a few of them, I mean, one is and this is a pretty common one. I think I read it in a book somewhere and started using it, but I start every morning. This is before I even get up out of bed. I literally just open my eyes, roll over, and I think about the three things I'm most grateful for. And then I think about the three goals that I have, and I frame the goals around like long-term goal, midterm goal, and the goal of today. Like, what am I going to accomplish today? And then same thing with the gratitude. I tend to think about like it tends to be around health, family, and then sort of like freedom to do what I love. I mean, those tend to be the things that I'm most grateful for, but I repeat them every single morning. And that's probably the most like powerful ritual that I have that I would recommend to others.
Yeah, gratitude's just amazing. And I love how you're setting out those different types of goals. Is there anything, look like somebody who's in incredible shape, which, when you've got the pressures and the opportunities of running such a successful, fast-paced business, is something you really need to build in habit-wise? Have you got a particular, physical habit that you've kind of disciplined into the morning or the day?
Yep, absolutely. It's exercise. And generally my form of exercise historically has been running, but unfortunately now I'm 37, so my knees aren't as strong as they were when I was in my 20s. So I'm running less now because my knees are always hurting me. But now what I'm doing in lieu of running is cycling. So I mountain bike. I've always loved mountain biking. And now I have where I live, I have access to mountain bike trails. So now I try to mountain bike almost every day. I would say it ends up being 5 days a week usually, but I'm either running or mountain biking every single day. And occasionally, if I don't have time, and by not have time, I mean, I always block this in my schedule. Obviously, my schedule is pretty full given my job, but I always block time for exercise in my schedule. Like if you look at it every single day, you'll see an exercise block. But occasionally it's just, I can't make it work. And in those scenarios, what I'll do is I'll take calls while going for a walk. So I at least still get my steps in that day, even if it's not, an intense cardio exercise.
What's a good step day for you? How many steps?
I actually don't count the steps, but I would say maybe I do on my Aura ring, but I would say the miles that I typically go are like, 6 to 8 or so on average, because I usually run 4 or 5, and then I'm walking a couple miles.
Yeah. So combined, that's awesome. There's this application on the blockchain called Sweatcoin, and we had Oleg, the founder, onto the show, and the product has huge traction, and it's really interesting because you can kind of see like what's a good amount of steps and so on and so forth. I think he says like over 12,000 is if it's just steps good, but if you're doing the running and then the steps, that's fantastic. What keeps you up at night?
I would say what keeps me up at night is just kind of the executional details around the business. Like startups are super hard. I mean, they may seem easy from the outside, like when you read the headlines and see all the growth, it's easy to assume that, they're not hard, but they're super hard. Let me tell you. I mean, even for the startups that find lightning in a bottle, like we were lucky enough to early on, where you just have kind of crazy escape velocity hypergrowth, like it's still incredibly hard. And, for us, like operationalizing lots of homes across lots of markets, whereby the lots of different owners are enjoying these homes, like that's a pretty hard thing to scale operationally. So I definitely think a lot about that. And, our goal in that context is always around providing the best possible customer experience, because if your customers are always happy, everything else kind of just takes care of itself. But delivering customer happiness at scale is not an easy thing to do. And then the other thing that doesn't keep me up at night, but is something that I really think about all the time, included at night, is people and culture. Businesses, and particularly, success in business, is all about having great people and great company culture that empowers people to do their best work. And that also does not happen by accident. Like it's a lot of hard work, having the right people working on the right things, empowering them to do their best work. and then scaling that, so I spend a lot of time thinking about that as well, because that's like the foundation of it all. Without great people, you kind of have nothing.
Austin, what would you say is, and by the way, read a lot on this myself and study it with our clients and my own organization. And, culture has been perceived historically as this kind of soft thing. And actually, you'll know this, and I think a lot of the greatest leaders will know this. You need to have an incredibly strong culture, actually. Mm-hmm. What would you say Pacasso's, either kookiest or strongest element of its culture is?
The strongest element, I'm not sure about the kooky part, but the strongest element is what we call our infinite mindset. So the first of our 5 core values is to embrace an infinite mindset, which basically means thinking on a time horizon, thinking and planning on a time horizon that's infinite. Bad companies think short term, good companies think long term. The greatest companies of all are thinking like very, very long term. Like for us, we're thinking about building a business that lasts generations and endures the test of time. Like, I want to spend the rest of my life working on Pacaso, and I want to create something with our team that literally lives on and becomes, greater than, like, much bigger and greater, and whereby the kind of the mission gets carried forward long after we're here, working at the company. So that attribute is very pronounced in the company culture, and I think it's a really important one. It's a really hard one, by the way, to like stay true to, because sometimes you have a lot of really intense short-term pressures. Like right now, all companies have a lot of really intense short-term pressure, and you got to respond to those short-term pressures as well, but you got to do it in the context of like the long-term or infinite goal.
Yep.
And I think we do a pretty good job of that internally.
Fantastic. Is there a book that you'd like to recommend to the audience that's really dear to you, you come back to a lot, you gift, you read recently and you like?
Yeah, there's lots of them. The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, which is where the infinite mindset kind of came from. That's what we were inspired by, is kind of the generic one that I would say. But during this time, I would say the most relevant book that I could think of is The Hard Things About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz.
Yeah.
Because this is one of these moments in the macro environment where there's just a lot of, challenge and headwind. And that's kind of part of the deal. That's part of the deal. If you're running a business or building a business, like, this comes with the territory, and he does a great job of capturing that in that book.
We'll put those in the show notes, and his most recent book, which is more on culture, is a super read as well. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Okay, fantastic. So what would you say your mana is?
Well, it depends who you ask. My board and investors would probably say it's my ability to build people and culture. Like, if you look at my first company, Loop, we were kind of known for the culture and people. And obviously all companies have, or all great companies have great people. So by no means am I saying that like our company's the only one that has great people. Like, lots of companies have that, but I think where we're unique is the culture that we've built. I mean, our culture is just, incredible. And at Pacaso, the culture is fully distributed, which is also, pretty novel and becoming more and more common. But there are certain things in a distributed environment that are harder to do as it relates to building culture. But I think we've done a really kind of incredible job doing that. But how I would answer that, so that's how my board would answer it. I would say my superpower is just around like what I was talking about before, around the kind of grit and determination. And this is really formed through hardship that you experience in your life. Like, those lows that you experience in your life kind of force you to develop grit and tenacity that enables you to persevere through any situation. And, there's really nothing that I'm afraid of. Well, I'm afraid of a lot of things, but I don't let fear slow me down. I try to do something every day that makes me a little uncomfortable and a little scared. And I'm just relentless, in pursuit of what I believe in.
On the Mana cards, which we'll put together for our incredible guests we've had on, we've got their grit and determination, and then we've got building fantastic people and culture. Grit and determination doesn't necessarily strike me as connecting necessarily to the other one. So I'm interested, you in a couple of instances now are super proud of building this brilliant culture in these organizations, and your investors believe that you're phenomenal at doing this. What's the personality trait there that makes that happen?
I think there's a few of them, but servant leadership is the first thing that comes to mind for me. It used to be that people thought that employees worked for leaders. I think that thinking is wrong and archaic. I think that leaders work for their teams. I approach every situation as though, I work for my team. And kind of the most important question that I ask in one-on-ones with my direct reports is, what can I do to help you do your job better? Or is there any roadblock that you're facing that I can help you with? Like, that's the most important role that I play as a leader. I would say another very important trait is kind of transparency and vulnerability. I am as vulnerable with, I basically exhibit, kind of almost maximum vulnerability with my team. And that's rare, for leaders. I think leaders, oftentimes leaders feel pressure to sort of live up to this persona, that leaders have. Like, if you look at some of the best leaders, it's easy to assume that those leaders are like superheroes that have no flaws, right? That feel no fear or pain or anxiety. But the reality is leaders are humans, just like everybody else. We have flaws too. We wake up scared. We wake up worried. Sometimes we don't know the answers to questions or problems we're trying to solve. And if you can expose that to your team and let people see the real you, what ends up happening is they realize that you're not a superhero. So you become more relatable, first and foremost. Number two, it's easier to trust someone. Like when you share your kind of your moments of weakness, like as an example, when I left my last company, the final day after I left Zillow, I stayed on for 4 years. I spoke on stage with, I don't know, 300 or 400 people on our team, and I was bawling. I was so emotional about kind of leaving this company that I had dedicated, 10 years of my life to, that I was just like hysterically crying on stage in front of 400 people. And, it's kind of embarrassing. I couldn't hold it back. But you know what, like after that, I mean, people just came up and they hugged me, and, many of them will never forget that moment, right? Because they saw the real me. So I think if you can be vulnerable like that as a leader, it just really enables you to connect with your team on a level that's highly, highly productive, as it relates to building culture. And that's why I think my board and investors would answer the question with that being my superpower. But for me, it kind of comes naturally, I guess. Like, I don't think of it as a superpower. I just think of it as like, this is how you work with a team. You be vulnerable, you serve your people. Like, these things seem fairly basic to me, which is why I don't think they're a superpower. But maybe that is why they're a superpower to me, because they come naturally. I'm not sure.
Well, I think, having, there's only so much time for this particular show, but having already, got to listen to your journey and hear you talk to particular topics, you're clearly incredibly thoughtful. And then with that, huge empathetic nature as well. Like you say, of course, it puts you and the team all on the same side, and that vulnerability certainly didn't make people dislike Roger Federer, who we just recently saw retire, and him and Nadal on the court balling as this, phenomenal GOAT era of tennis comes to an end. I mean, quite the reverse. So I completely 100% agree with that. Amazing. So just moving on to the final part where we do some future projections. You've already given, I would say, the audience what is some type of Hollywood version of Pacaso. And, you know, because that strong culture that you guys have is to not think about the short or the medium term, but have an infinite mindset when you're thinking through this business and for it to be generationally valuable. We can talk about that as the final bit if you want to put any layer on top of that, and we don't have particularly long left. But it'd be interesting just to get your view on the macro environment right now, and anything that Austin you'd like to talk about to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, the main thing that I'd like to kind of finish with is just talking about the future of housing as it relates to kind of the role of second homes. And like we've just gone through a period with the pandemic that permanently shifted the way that many people think about, you know, housing as it relates to how they live and how they work. And the big change has been around flexibility. More people have flexibility now to work remote, part-time or full-time, and that has empowered more people to kind of rethink where they live. So I think as we look into the future, I think you're going to see kind of new categories of housing emerge, and we're pioneering one of them around co-ownership. And the reason why I'm so confident that co-ownership is going to become, like, you know, potentially the way to own a second home for most people is because, number one, it's more accessible. I mean, home prices have gotten to a level that make it impossible for most people to afford. But that doesn't change the fact that, you know, 75% to 80% of people kind of above a certain income threshold aspire to own a second home. Like, this is a widespread aspiration that people have, but it's out of reach due to, you know, home prices and waste. So, like, there has to be a better way from that perspective. We're also living in a world where we have to think about sustainability and the environment, and it's incredibly wasteful to have homes sitting empty, you know, consuming energy, and polluting the environment. Like, we have to explore more sustainable solutions across all industries, not just housing, and co-ownership is that for second homes. And I think the final piece relates to kind of the housing industry and home prices in particular. Like, there are a lot of empty second homes sitting around the world. Like in London alone, it's estimated that there's $40 billion worth of real estate that's sitting vacant at any given point in time. All that empty real estate is further constraining supply. And we already, in pretty much all markets, but definitely in London as well, we have low inventory levels. And when you have low inventory levels, it causes, you know, home prices to stay high or to go higher. All that empty housing stock is further constraining supply. If you can free up that housing stock and empower people to buy it and occupy it, it'll create more opportunity and more supply to kind of normalize the market and relieve some of the pressure on home price appreciation. So for those three reasons, I think that co-ownership is, you know, here to stay, and I think it's really going to kind of change housing, you know, for the better, and empower a lot more people to realize their dreams while also making better use of existing supply. In terms of the macro environment, I mean, it's tough out there, but in these moments, what I find is that it's important to just zoom out to 50,000 feet and, you know, not look in terms of months or quarters, but kind of look back at the past and the future, you know, over periods of years. You know, like if you look back over a period of the last 30 years, for example, what you'll see is lots of highs and lots of lows. And, you know, when you're in the moment of one of these lows, it feels tough. But if you're able to sort of zoom out and position yourself or your company to really look for the opportunities in these moments of low, you will emerge stronger on the other side of it. Like at Pacaso, while it's super tough, you know, to be in this environment long term, I'm very excited, you know, about what it means for our company. I think we'll emerge stronger with a lot of new opportunity that kind of wouldn't have surfaced had it not been for this macro environment. So I would encourage everyone to just kind of zoom out, put it in perspective, try to stay present. Don't get too caught up in the negative headlines. This will pass, but it's probably going to be a little while. It's this little dip is not just going to be a quarter or two. I don't think. I think it's going to be a year or two. But we'll get through it, and we'll emerge stronger on the other side.
Well, I'm highly confident of that, Austin. He earned it on the front cover, and I know you'll carry on doing what you're doing. So look, congratulations for getting to this point. It's really exciting. I love what you're doing. We'll put some notes around how people can look into Pacaso, and I'll be one of the people doing that immediately. It's unbelievable. As this moves forward, guys, Pacaso very much, believes that, second home should be something that everybody can really access. And as Austin said, and I'm sure we can all relate to, and particularly with hybrid work and the way the world is changing, if you're in cities, so valuable to have somewhere that you go to or get away to, but it's incredibly unaffordable as the world is right now. So, kind of amen to Pacaso, to you, Austin, for doing this. I absolutely love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. It was my pleasure.